Good day, students. Welcome to today's lesson. Today we begin Unit 2, where we would look at a framework to engage in effective environmental analysis, and we will be covering this topic over the next few weeks. Okay, so we begin with looking at what exactly is environmental analysis. So it's essentially a definition we are looking at here. So environmental analysis is a strategic tool, right? And that tool is for the purpose of identity. It is for the purpose of carrying out a process that we need in order to identify all the external and internal elements that can affect an environment. So we say organization or environment. In both cases, it really is environment. It would be an internal environment in case of the organization or your external environment. So they're normally various factors or variables that can affect an environment. So environmental analysis can help us identify what those elements are. So the analysis itself entails assessing the level of threat or opportunity that these various factors may present. So you may be familiar with the concept of SWOT analysis, which we will look at briefly a little later on in this same lesson. SWOT analysis is one of those tools that can be used to conduct environmental analysis. These evaluations from environmental analysis, they are later translated into the decision-making processes. So the findings that you will gather from your environmental analysis can facilitate decision-making. So let's talk a bit more about the factors that can affect the environmental factors that can affect an organization. So we're looking at the internal organization, but in this case, we are seeing the identification of several factors that actually can be external factors that can affect what happens within your organization. Okay. Right, so I believe we'll be looking at those next. So we have technology trends. So technology trends, to what extent are technologies affecting your internal organization? Technology, as we know, changes rapidly over time. And the way in which your organization utilizes these technologies can affect your internal environment. It can affect your level of productivity. It can affect the culture in your environment. Right now, we are all exposed to so much technology that you certainly can identify on various levels, how even on a personal level, technology and the way technology changes can affect levels of productivity. When we consider the amount of remote work that has been happening now, we look at how, for example, we are experiencing remote learning in a way that we never knew that we could achieve. So all of this is and can affect an internal environment. So what technological developments or trends are affecting your environment, and how does it affect the industry? Is it affecting it for the better? Is it affecting it for the worse? For example, when you look at retail, retail, a significant amount of retail has gone online now. Many stores and retail outlets that did not have a history of online shopping are they are actually affected or influenced, sorry, they have actually adapted this type of retail activity using technology now. Additionally, government and economic trends. What changes in regulation are possible and what will be their impact? So what happens out there, what decisions your government makes or what happens in the economy can affect the way in which your organization operates as well. If there are new regulations put in place, it may be important or it may be necessary for your organization to accommodate those regulations. You may have to put internal company policies in place in order to accommodate those requirements. Are there political risks? One aspect of that political risk could be regulations may change with each passing government. So these are some of the risks that political risks that may be involved there. What taxes or other incentives are being developed that might affect your operational strategy? Are there new taxes in place? Maybe environmental friendly taxes? Is that going to affect your bottom line in your company? Should you adapt to that? Should you not adapt to it? These are things that you want to consider. You may also want to look at how national taxes can affect level of inflation in a country and customers' ability to buy. Next point, what are the economic prospects for the countries in which the firm operates? These are other things that you would want to consider as well. So here we're looking at the variable of government and economy. We see over the years and in recent years, some international companies in Trinidad have chosen to pack up and leave because they've considered that the economic climate in Trinidad at this particular point in time was not favorable to their operations. So these are some of the things that can happen as well. Consumer trends. What are the current or emerging trends in lifestyle, fashions, and other components of culture? How is that affecting your organization? Again, we can go back to that whole point of online shopping. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a lot of things, and the way we operate, the way we do business in the world on a global scale has definitely changed. So how have these influenced the way in which an organization can operate? Again, we had mentioned remote work, online shopping, all kinds of various things. I'm sure there are many more examples that you all can come up with because you have had personal experience with this. Okay, you all forgive me if I have to pause periodically. I will have to take a little sip of water from time to time. Second point, what demographic trends will affect the market size of the country, of the industry, sorry, or its submarkets? So you have to look at your demographics as well. All right, where you have not only a growing population, but what are the age groups? Your organization would have to look at some of these things to determine if there are opportunities there or if there are threats. Right? Innovations. So here we've identified 3 major categories of innovations. We have innovations that can be transformational in the sense that it changes what people buy. And this changes the assets and the competencies that are needed by your company. So if your company has to change basically its mission and its vision, maybe make changes and alterations to the product or services that it is providing, you will have to make changes to your assets, your employees will need new training, etc. So this is another how should I call it? This is another variable or another element that will need to be assessed as part of your environmental analysis. Innovation can also be substantial in the sense that significant change can result as a new generation offering. So if we're talking generation, or let's look at something very common and familiar to all of us. Let's look at these phones. Again, we've talked about how technology is changing so rapidly, and I know they even refer to these new offerings of phones as another generation. And each one seems to have a lot more features than the other. And these innovations can actually change the actual type of product that you would need to offer. Innovation may also be incremental in the sense that it makes a new offering more attractive or less costly. All right. So if you want to actually survive out there as a business or an organization, you would need to make some of these products and services more available to your market. Another issue you may want to look at when you're doing environmental analysis would be going green or being green. So motivation is very important in terms of going green. So let us consider at this point in time, end of October, early November 2021, the G20 summit was just completed with a main focus on the climate change crisis. So what we find is globally, because this past year, 2021, we have experienced some natural disasters on a scale across the world that we have never seen before. Countries that were not accustomed experiencing natural disasters experienced massive flooding, landslides, wildfires, earthquakes, you name it, right across the world. And as a result, you find that many governments across the world now, there is a high motivation to attempt to do something to stem the progress of climate change by reducing the levels of carbon emission. So there's a high level of motivation at this point in time. Additionally, being green, one of the things they would look at as well is what are the practical benefits to customers and to firms of going green. All right, so you would need to investigate aspects like that. We talked about global warming. So at this point in time, there's a great awareness of the level of global warming as evidenced by all of these natural disasters that have social and environmental impacts as well. All right, and additionally, what are the views of your customers and employees regarding going green? What is the level of respect for this position? So these are things that you would want to consider if you are doing an analysis and you are collecting data with regards to this issue of going green. Let us now look at environmental analysis in terms of our economic environmental analysis, in terms of our internal, micro, and macro environments. So as you can see in the schematic here, we have several issues or several factors that should be considered under each category. So we will look at each one in turn. So in our internal environment, we can conduct environmental analysis based on internal factors and how these factors help or hinder our organizational performance. So your analysis would be based on level of performance, as we can see here, level of performance of your processes, training, management, and retention. So these are different, let's call them variables that you can assess to determine level of performance. And that information can help you determine the strengths and weaknesses of your organization by looking specifically at these issues. Okay. Now, we are just looking at these issues on a very general, superficial level. But when it comes to actually conducting these kind of analyses, there are many frameworks and guidelines out there that you could possibly identify something that has already been designed in another study where you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It is probably something that you can take and adapt to your particular situation. Now, the near or microenvironment, which is that what to call it, that environment immediately outside of your internal environment that affects your operations, will comprise of industries and sectors, competitors and markets where your organization competes for resources and for customers. So examples of this would be, you can have the threat of new rivals, sorry. So you'll have competition there that will cut into the market that is available to you. What is this bargaining power of your buyers, the bargaining power of your sellers? Okay, and also, is there a threat of a substitute product that can now reduce your market as well, right? So if you are analyzing your neo micro environment, these are some of the things that you would want to look at, again, to determine your levels of strength and weaknesses of your organization in terms of meeting your performance and meeting your objectives. And now there is also the far or micro environment. So that's a wider and external environment. So your wider external environment will have several issues or several factors that you would need to pay attention to. There's a political. So your existing and potential influences that the government places on your organization. For example, you have government agencies, let's say, for example, town and country planning, you have the EMA, you have agencies and other pressure groups that can influence the way in which you do business, the way in which you carry out your operations. All right, next, there's the economy. So again, these are the wider external factors. So the impact that the national and international economy can have on all types of organizations. Example, when bank interest rates are low, people have more disposable income to spend on a range of goods and services. So this is something that your organization cannot control. Your organization will just have to prepare to adapt to it. Socially, you can have changes in society that have a considerable impact on your organization's strategies. For example, where you have increasing environmental awareness, it creates a demand for environmentally friendly products. Okay, so it all depends on what is happening out in society, what the demand for levels of understanding, attitudes, awareness can affect your organization and may probably force your organization to transition to environmentally friendly products and services. Technology, where we talked about technology a bit before. So technological advances probably have the most profound effect on an organization's strategy. Example, we have the internet that has transformed the way in which organizations sell their products and how they communicate with customers and employees across the globe. So again, we know we have a lot of services and products being traded and purchased online. We see even in terms of outside of retail and business, we see lots of conferences and various things being conducted online now that prior to all this technological development, everything would be face-to-face, and it would actually provide funding for some of these organizations where hotels and different things would have to be put, you would have to pay for it. Now everything has been transformed into a different type of operation that will change the way in which business is actually done. Right, so legal. Organizations need to be aware of existing and upcoming local, national, and international legislation that can affect their business. And these legislations can range from employment laws, competition laws, health and safety regulations, and actually the list can go on and on. So it's important that organizations are aware of this so that you can ensure that you fall into line, that you're not in violation of any of the laws that would put your organization at risk for fines and various types of penalties. Then there is the environmental assessment. Remember, we are still talking about economics. The environmental factor. So where we have environmental protection laws and regulations, as well as attitudes to energy consumption and waste disposal, all of these things can affect our organization and the way in which we do business. So again, you want to stay in compliance with the environmental protection laws and regulations. Then of course, your society's attitude towards consumption, is it responsible? Is it overconsumption? How do we dispose of our waste? All of these things, an organization that does any kind of business will want to take these things into consideration, because as we talked about previously, if you have an organization, if you have a society that is becoming environmentally aware, they will be watching the way in which you carry out your business. How do you do your waste disposal and all of these things? And it may influence their willingness to support your business. So that's just one perspective on it. Now we want to talk briefly about the 3 spheres or pillars of sustainability. Now, most of you should be familiar with this concept of the 3 pillars or 3 spheres of sustainability. We have our environmental sphere, our economic sphere, and our social sphere. Each one of them can exist on their own, but in reality, we know that everything is interrelated. So where we have an intersection of all 3 spheres in terms of activities and focus, this is where we can achieve sustainability. Now, I'm not going to go through all the examples, but this chart actually shows you some examples of pure environmental, pure economic, and pure social. And you also see some examples of where we have intersections of 2. So I would like for you all to at least be able to give examples of each of them. But the reason we're going to look briefly at the pillars of sustainability is, as we carry out our environmental analysis, we can organize our environmental analysis according to these 3 pillars. So here it is very important for us to note, most national and international problem-solving efforts focus only on one pillar at a time. All right, so note again, very important here. So what do we mean by that? Example, we have the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program. Also, you find environmental protection agencies like the US EPA or our AMA of many nations, these agencies, as well as NGOs. You find their focus tends to be almost exclusively on the environmental sphere. Then you also have other organizations like the World Trade Organizations, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Those types of economic and trade organizations, they focus mostly on economic growth. Then if you consider situations where, because we have wars in many parts of the world, if a war breaks out, certainly environmental sustainability has 0 priority. What you find happening in these kind of war-torn environments is the environment is almost totally decimated, not only destroying the environment itself, but the ability of persons to actually survive in that kind of environment, because many of the natural resources are destroyed. Additionally, when you consider most developing countries, you find a focus tends to be on socioeconomic growth, essentially survival and standard of living, increased standard of living. So the problem here results in that because you have this single-minded focus on one sphere or maybe two spheres, you have a system that does not facilitate true sustainability. All right, so if you have, so as this last point says, if you have one weak sphere, then the entire system is unsustainable. So even if you focus on two, one has been ignored and disregarded, the entire system is now flawed. Okay, this diagram here also attempts to explain or summarize some of what we have been talking about. So here we have our natural processes and our natural environment that would look at the landscape characteristics in general, then your land use. And on this side, we have our socioeconomic processes, population and landscape dynamics, policies and actions, governance, etc. Right? So here we can see an almost cyclical and dynamic interaction between these two blocks, where we see society and our natural environment are vulnerable to both, right? And they can impact each other. Additionally, we see where these processes here can also have a one-way impact on land use change in terms of how these processes can affect our land use. All right. So again, this is interaction of the different spheres that we are looking at. So let's talk a bit now about environmental data. So we have internal sources of environmental data. So these internal sources we are referring to here, again, would be in the context of organizational resources. So our internal resources, they may be a good source of data on things like customer needs, attitudes, and behaviors. And the organization's own records are the best source of data on current objectives, performance, and available resources, because the assumption you're making is that your organization would be doing at least annual audits and assessments of their performance and you know, conducting audits and assessments that would provide current information on these issues and factors. Also, the sheer volume of available information on the economy, population, and business activities is a major strength of most government data sources. So that's always a good, when you need that kind of information, demographic information, information on the economy, all those things, the government sources are an excellent source of information there. For example, in Trinidad, you find there are a number of government platforms now that are publicly accessible for information of this nature. Additionally, another source of information are articles and research reports that are available in periodicals, books, that provide a lot of information about organizations, industries, and nations. Some organizations have their own libraries that if you go to them, you can actually get some access to some annual reports if you're looking for information, government ministries to get information on industries, etc. So another useful set of information can be had from these sources. Okay, they're also commercial sources. They're almost always relevant to specific issues because they deal with the actual behaviors of customers in the marketplace. So commercial sources of information, so a specific organization or business, they should have reports as well that may be available. Again, as I said, many of these organizations may also have libraries, so you can get access to those library resources. The best approach to secondary data collection is one that blends data and information from a variety of sources. So remember, in a previous lesson, we would have talked about triangulation of information, where you would use different types of information about the same issue, and you can compare that information in order to not only gain further accuracy, but gain a better, deeper understanding of the issue. So here we talk about blending data and information. So your information may be, for example, reports from different agencies and organizations, and the data would be your numeric data that you may have collected from primary or other sources of information. So if needed, and secondary data is not available, out of date, inaccurate, or unreliable, or irrelevant to a specific problem, the manager may have little choice but to collect primary data, right, through market research. So, so where the secondary data collection is available, you can use that. But where it is not available and it's not relevant, you will find yourself being forced to collect primary data. Now, in your case, for the purpose of your senior research, you would be required to collect primary data. Secondary data may be acceptable for use as complementary or supporting data, but primary data collection would be critical and also be required of you. So the next issue we want to cover is overcoming problems with data. One of the most common problems is an incomplete or inaccurate assessment of the situation for which the data is being gathered to address, right? So if it is inaccurate or if it is incomplete, this is what we're talking about. So this is a problem here, all right? Another common difficulty is the expense of collecting environmental data. So typically environmental data would often be the responsibility of government agencies because of its costliness. It's very costly and very extensive, takes a very long time. As the third point says, takes a very long time to collect this data. So it's often the purview of government agencies. Another challenge is finding a way to organize the vast amount of data and information that are collected during environmental analysis. Okay, so these are some of the challenges that you find that we have to deal with, especially when working with environmental data. These are some of the challenges we have to encounter, or we often encounter. Additionally, knowledge gained from data is fundamental to our understanding of the environmental issues, as well as for communicating information to policymakers and other groups. So we need this information. It's critical. We have all those challenges we've identified, but it is critical, not just to help us understand the issues, but once we have understood the issues now, we have to find a way to communicate to the policymakers, because they are the ones who will make the changes. These are the ones that we call the change makers. And if we can get them to understand the issues, we would hope and expect that they would make the decisions that can impact the environment. So the challenge here often is the issue of communicating that information. Last point here, however, without good quality relevant data and indicators, so those indicators would be the things that we are measuring, the assessment loses not only valuable communication tools, so the reports that you would get out of it would be a communication tool, but it also loses credibility and the ability to measure progress toward sustainability goals and objectives. So the point we're making here is, if you don't have good quality data, you do not have a good communication tool to communicate the issues to the policymakers, and therefore you cannot make progress towards sustainability. Let us address the issue of the complexity of the environment now. So there are a vast number of environmental components and subcomponents. Our environment is very, very complex. And the more of these components that need to be assessed and considered, it adds to your level of uncertainty in your analysis and your final conclusions and results. So solutions are linked to knowledge about the different facets. So basically what we're saying is where you have less knowledge or less certainty, you're less likely to be able to adequately address the problem. And this is the whole issue here, because the environment is so complex and so many issues, is that you have such high levels of uncertainty when trying to address or understand all these different factors, that it is really is very difficult for you to successfully address the environmental problems, because oftentimes you don't know what the outcome will be. So complex systems often exhibit variability over a wide range of scales. So for example, when you consider different varying scales of things like your oceans, continents, soils, rocks, etc., your assessment of, let's say, the marine north coast of Trinidad is going to be very different from if you are doing a marine study of the Caribbean on a regional scale, because the landscape, the environment itself is different when you change from micro scale to macro scale. So it becomes more complex. So your environmental complexity, it plays a key role in the development of your social structures and the ecology of organisms. So in other words, your understanding of the complexity of the environment will influence those three pillars that we were talking about: social, economic, and environment. Okay? Or at least it should influence it. So next, what we want to talk about, we want to look briefly at some of these methodologies or frameworks that we can use in conducting environmental analyses. We're going to look firstly at the SWOT analysis, an impact assessment, strategic assessments, DPSIR approaches, and data collection in terms of quantitative and qualitative. Some of these will be addressed in additional supplemental material that is available on the eClassroom as well. Okay. Let's look at SWOT analysis. So as we would have mentioned before, a SWOT analysis identifies strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of an organization, community, and external stakeholders involved in the intervention. All right, so SWOT is a framework or a type of guideline for carrying out an environmental analysis. So the SWOT analysis is an effective means of identifying support and potential stumbling blocks for change. Right? So this diagram here, this little flow diagram, kind of summarizes for us what a SWOT analysis might look like. Here we see situation analysis. So you're doing an analysis of the current situation of your organization. So note how it's organized by internal environment here and external environment. In your internal environment, you conduct an assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of your environment, your internal environment, which is within your organization. And the external environment is oftentimes what will produce the threats and the opportunities for your organization. So you can conduct a SWOT analysis using a framework like this. So again, very important for you to note when you're conducting a SWOT analysis, oftentimes your strengths and weaknesses would be internal factors within your organization. and the opportunities and threats would be based on factors that may be external to the organization. Then we also have a DPSIR framework. This particular framework we would look at in some detail over the next couple of weeks. But just to give you a little introduction, the DPSIR framework, as you will see, D meaning driving force, P pressures, S state, S would be state of the environment, I impact on the environment, and R response. Okay, so this framework was developed for the purpose of guiding integrated environmental assessment. Integrated meaning complex, essentially. So according to the DPSIR framework, there is a chain of causal links starting with, as I said, the driving forces, which would be things like economic sectors, human activities. So we go from driving forces to pressures. Pressures would be things like emissions and waste into the environment, which will have a state, which will cause the environment to come into a particular state that can be measured by physical, chemical, or biological characteristics. That state will then have an impact on ecosystems, such as human health and the functions of the environment. And eventually, this will often prompt responses from decision makers in an attempt to intervene or arrest these impacts in the environment. So it may be prioritization, target setting, maybe things like laws, etc., that may have to be implemented and enforced in order to have some kind of intervention in that response. So here is a schematic of what that framework may look like. So we talked about the driving forces. So the driving forces, again, remember we said human activities that will cause human needs, sorry. Those human needs will cause human beings to carry out certain activities to meet their needs that would put pressure on the environment. That pressure on the environment would now often result in waste generated that will affect the state of the environment. That state of the environment will impact usually things like human and animal life, the quality of the environment, quality of the water, the air, etc. And then we will have and human impacts as well. And usually at this stage is when we expect a response. And then of course the cycle can continue because a response should also have an impact on the level of driving forces evident. Right, so I kind of went through there a little bit with you guys, but here we have the clear written explanation. So driving forces, primary driving forces, for example, basic needs, shelter, food, water. Secondary force driving forces, the need for mobility. So we're talking about things like transportation here, entertainment and culture. So these needs would put pressures on the environment that cause human activities to meet those needs, such as transportation and food production, often resulting in waste into the environment, will cause a certain state that affect the quality of the environment, which will then impact the environment, impact our ecosystems, life supporting abilities, etc. And then a response at this point would be required by society or our policy makers in an attempt to intervene here at this point, to have some effect on the driving forces and the impacts on the environment. Here I have a very specific DPSIR conceptual framework for you that focuses on the issue of water quantity resources. I'm not going to go through this in detail with you guys. I am going to make this available to you for you to study it carefully. So you study it again in the way we were looking at it. You start with your driving forces, and then you make your way through pressure, state, impact, and responses. Okay, now most of you are environmental students, whether you specialize in water and water related courses or environmental management, you should have a basic understanding of these issues here. So I expect you all to be able to study it and explain this thoroughly. Okay, so at this point, we are concluding our lesson. I would like to refer you to the supplemental reading on the e-classroom. So you're looking for the IA Training Manual Module 1 summary. And you are also going to complete the activity, the lesson activity that's provided on e-classroom for you for this lesson. Thank you for joining me for today, and I will see you online.